7. Evidence. Early Tuesday morning, on Main Street in Queens, the weather was just awful. It was pouring, with fat raindrops bouncing off the sidewalks. Car headlights were reflecting off the road surface, in places now inches deep in water. I splashed along the sidewalk. My hat and coat were soaking wet by the time I got to the subway station. At East 43rd Street, it all seemed like a normal day. Stella was already at her desk, going through the morning mail. She gave me her usual bright, "Hi, Nat." But underneath that cheerful exterior, I knew she was deeply worried. As soon as I'd woken up, I'd phoned the hospital to get an update on Jose's condition. I was simply told, no change. The investigation into Jose's evening at Brighton Beach had made little progress. I'd also had a call from Lena Rosenthal. Oldenburg had given all the relevant police information to Lena, our lawyer. This included the autopsy report on Romanoff. We had arranged a mid-morning meeting at East 43rd Street. Over breakfast, I did some thinking. I recalled the basic points of police procedure, which I'd been taught years ago at the NYPD Academy. In every investigation, always establish MOM, which stands for motive, opportunity, and means. Motive. Why did the suspect commit the crime? Opportunity. Did the suspect have the chance to carry out the crime? Means. Did the suspect have the weapon to carry out the crime? But when you applied this system to Jose, nothing seemed to make sense. There's nothing out of the ordinary in a guy having too many drinks and waking up in a strange bar. But how and why could he suddenly come into the possession of a handgun, steal a car, and commit murder? Later that morning, Lena was going through some of the details of Romanoff's autopsy report with me. "What worries me, Nat, is timing," she began. "We know that Jose probably left the Odessa steps at or around 9 o'clock. According to this report, Romanoff's time of death was somewhere between 8:45 and 9:45 the same evening. Now, for a drunk who'd just woken up, Jose would have to have been one fast mover." "Agreed," I said. "There's absolutely nothing to show how or where he came across Romanoff," Lena continued. "Did he just walk out into the street, wave a car to stop, and then rob and brutally murder the driver? As I see it, there's no logic here. No supporting evidence apart from the forensics." "Anything more in the reports?" "Cause of death, a gunshot to the head at close range. Romanoff was on the ground when he was killed. According to the report, there was bruising on his upper arms, which could indicate the killer was standing on his arms when the fatal shot was fired." Stella, who had been making some notes, suddenly interrupted. "Ms. Rosenthal, I need to get something clear. The fingerprints that were found on the gun barrel, right hand or left hand prints?" "All right hand prints, according to the report," Lena replied. Stella said nothing, but just looked down at the notepad. "Stella, is Jose right-handed?" I asked. Stella nodded. Another setback. If only Jose wasn't left-handed. Another possible line of investigation closed. Oldenburg had not followed official procedure after Dr. Erickson had reported the bruises on Jose's neck. With some minor blackmail, I could ask a favor. I thought I might have a talk with Oldenburg. I knew a subject that would hold his attention: baseball. His mind is an encyclopedia of baseball history. Oldenburg, it's Marley. Just called to tell you I've been admiring a bat used by the Brooklyn Dodgers in the final game of the 1955 World Series. There was a low whistle of surprise from Oldenburg. I knew I had his full attention. It's a valuable piece of baseball history, I continued, and you can see it for yourself at the Odessa Steps Bar on Brighton Beach. They've got a whole museum of baseball stuff around the walls. But last Wednesday night, some guy pulled this bat off the wall. Hey, that would be terrible. That guy would be lucky to get out of the place in one piece, I suggested. That's what people at the bar told me. And the guy is the accused, Jose de la Cruz. But he got out of the bar somehow. And then look what happened to him. Kind of strange, don't you think? Especially when the bar staff went suspiciously quiet when I asked what happened after Jose grabbed the bat. I don't know what to say, Marley. This information might have an effect on the case. Think about it. Now, I continued, it's come to my attention that the medical staff at Metropolitan reported bruising on De La Cruz's neck, which couldn't have been the result of the car crash. But you didn't order a medical examination of my client. How did you know about that? Demanded Oldenburg. Just doing my job, I replied calmly. I have my contacts. I'm prepared to ignore this failure to follow official procedure if you do me a little favor. I need an official introduction from the NYPD to Lockhart, commander of the Coast Guard Group in Mauritius. That's the Long Island South section. What's this all about, Marley? Let's just say another line of inquiry. 1 o'clock. It had been a busy morning, and I could hear a cold beer calling my name from McFadden's Bar. McFadden's Bar is just a block across town from the office, on 2nd Avenue, a favorite watering hole for New York journalists. I phoned the bar to check whether Ed Winchester was there. Ed's an old friend and a wonderful source of information. He'd been chief crime reporter for the Daily News for years, and still did some part-time work for the paper, though he was now officially retired. No sooner had I entered the bar than I heard my name being called. A tall, elderly guy with silver hair and a deeply lined face was waving an empty glass at me. Nat! Perfect timing, Ed said. That must mean your glass needs refilling, I replied. I took the beers over to an empty table and went through all the recent events with Ed. Romanoff's death, Jose's night out at Brighton Beach, the wrecked lifeboat, and the bodies on Jones Beach. You see, Ed, there seem to be Russian connections everywhere. I was just curious whether you'd heard anything about crime among the Russian community. Money laundering is the big one, he replied. In international terms, the Russian ruble is seen as little more than toy money. So much of the real business of crime is done in hard currency, in U.S. dollars. A lot of illegal dollars from that black economy are probably coming into the USA from Russia. The problem then is how to integrate that money into the legal economy here without attracting attention. I'd heard about money laundering. Anybody running organized crime operations, like drugs or illegal gambling, receives huge amounts of cash. Thus, the need for your friendly neighborhood money launderer to clean the dirty money by transferring it through a network of bank accounts until nobody can find where it came from. Once it reappears at the other end of the process, the money's clean and legal. Ed called the crime desk to see if they knew of any money laundering activity in the Russian community. He listened carefully for a couple of minutes, then turned to me with a broad smile. "There's a guy by the name of Victor Kamenev," he said. "It seems he was depositing regular amounts of cash, up to $10,000 at a time, in a variety of banks around Lower Manhattan. He's got a business, Kamenev Finance. Of course, there was the usual gossip at the crime desk as to whether he was laundering money for the Russian mafia, but no concrete evidence." Ed had delivered the goods again, and cheap at the price of a beer. Another Russian name. But was there any possible connection between Romanov's death and the wreck on Jones Beach? I walked across town to First Avenue and wandered through the United Nations Plaza over to the East River. Walking time is thinking time, so I just ignored the rain. I needed a way to gain access to the Russian community. Alexei Romanov's widow could be our entry key. But under the circumstances, we might have to be a little economical with the truth. The initial approach to Mrs. Romanov would need tact and sensitivity, more Stella's specialty than mine. Back at the office, after describing the plan to Stella, she made that all-important call. Her telephone manner was, as always, perfect. "Mrs. Romanov? I'm very sorry to disturb you at this extremely sad time. I'm Stella Delgado. My employer, Mr. Nat Murley, is investigating a matter which is of deep concern to the Russian community." After Stella had completed the call, we had an appointment for the following afternoon. Chapter 8. Mrs. Romanov. It was one of those March mornings when the weather still hadn't made up its mind if it's the depth of winter or the beginning of spring. An icy wind was cutting across Manhattan. A few snowflakes were falling from the heavy gray clouds. I'd arranged to meet Stella at Metropolitan Hospital, where she'd been at Jose's bedside with her mom. Stella was waiting outside the main entrance, shivering with cold. "You'll catch your death of cold out here, Stella," I said. "I prefer it out here. Right now, I've had enough of hospitals. I've just been with Jose for an hour. There's no change. Still in a deep coma. Just the same as before. At least the police are being more relaxed about access now that he's unconscious. I'd like to see him anyway, now that I'm here, I said. We made our way up to Jose's room. As usual, the police guard was on duty outside the room. Through the window, I could see Stella's mom at the bedside, talking to the unconscious Jose. See that, Matt? Mom spends hour after hour chatting to him. She's convinced she's getting through to him, but I haven't noticed any kind of response. Let's hope it does some good, I said. I didn't feel it was appropriate to enter the room. Jose was with his family. I knew that the unconscious brain can still be active and functioning. I just hoped he was receiving something that might get through whatever block was keeping him from regaining consciousness. Yesterday, Oldenburg had emailed me a letter of introduction to a Commander Lockhart of the U.S. Coast Guard, who was based at the Mauritius Coast Guard Station. I'd already made an appointment to talk to him about the Jones Beach wreck. The wrecked lifeboat was now being stored at Jones Beach Coast Guard Station, and I had arranged to meet Lockhart there. I was curious to examine it and prove any new Russian connections. As far as this investigation was concerned, it was all a very long shot. It could easily be a pointless visit, but I felt we should be doing something for Jose. The subway was clear of the worst of the rush-hour crowds. As the number 4 train sped downtown toward Midtown Manhattan, I thought over what I knew about Jose's night out in Brighton Beach. If only he would regain consciousness, then he might recall something relevant. From 51st Street, an E-train took us west across town to Penn Station, where we took a Long Island Railroad train to Freeport. A 40-minute journey, but quicker and cheaper than any cab. As the train made its way through the suburbs of Queens, I noticed Stella biting her lip. I know that little habit of hers. It means something is on her mind. Are you okay, Stella? I asked. This past week, Nat, has been a total nightmare. I'm tense and anxious all the time. We seem to be getting nowhere fast. I know it's not your fault. You're doing everything you possibly can. But there are times when I feel like tearing my hair out and screaming. Don't give up hope, Stella, I said. I won't let Jose down. Believe me. I'm positive the evidence is out there. The pressure's getting me down, too. If this was an ordinary, everyday investigation, I'd be able to walk away from it and put it right out of my mind. But it's there with me all the time. If I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm thinking about it. We'll crack this case, somehow. We took a cab from Freeport to the Jones Beach Coast Guard Station, where we were welcomed by the officer responsible for Long Island South, Commander Lockhart, a tall, fit-looking man in his 50s. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Marley, said Lockhart, shaking my hand with a firm grip. Captain Oldenburg asked me to give you every possible assistance. Thanks, I said. This is my assistant, Stella Delgado. We're working on a case that just might have a connection with the recent incident on Jones Beach. As you know, we'd like to see that wrecked lifeboat which was recovered, I replied. Lockhart took us out to a workshop alongside the Coast Guard building. Inside was part of what had once been a well-built boat. The paint was peeling off it. Some clean, fresh wood was visible where the boat had split in two. At the back of the boat were the faded letters. They did look like Russian letters. Lockhart took a screwdriver from a workbench and pointed at a section of the boat. "I'd like to demonstrate to you just how poor the condition of this boat is," he announced. He drove the blade of the screwdriver into the wood. It went through with little effort. The wood was completely rotten. Stella gasped. "Those poor guys!" she exclaimed. "They wouldn't have had a chance." "This boat was no more than a floating grave," Lockhart continued. "It's completely falling apart." "What about the 4 guys who were found on Jones Beach?" I asked. "I have the full autopsy details in my office. Shall we go there and I'll show you?" he suggested. Inside his office, Lockhart sorted through a pile of documents. "Here we are. Cause of death, exposure, and drowning. They must have floated for as long as they could, maybe holding on to what was left of the boat. But the chance of survival in those temperatures would have been very slight," he said. "Was there any form of identification on the bodies?" asked Stella. "All that was found were some Russian labels on their clothes and a Russian Orthodox cross. But otherwise, we've no identification. We're running a check with the Russian authorities, but these things take time." "Off the record, what do you think really happened to these guys?" I asked. "Our guess is an illegal immigration operation," Lockhart began. "They probably paid a huge amount of money for the privilege of being smuggled from Russia into the USA. In cases like these, another bigger boat would be involved, probably a small fishing boat. They remain offshore, then transfer the immigrants into smaller boats." "Are you talking about occasional incidents or regular shipments of immigrants?" I asked. "We suspect regular traffic. We've had a number of reports of suspicious activity from routine Coast Guard patrols. The Coast Guard has carried out a number of search and seizure operations at sea, but our resources are limited. For every illegal immigrant we seize, there could be others slipping through the net. Of course, we question the ones we catch, but never learn anything really useful, like names of the people behind the operation." "Thanks," I said. "This has been very useful. If I discover anything relevant, I'll let you know." "Mr. Marley, whoever put any people into that boat might as well have been holding a gun to their heads," said Lockhart. "You realize there could still be more bodies? It could take time before they're all washed onto the beach." From Jones Beach, we took a cab to Brighton Beach. The heavy clouds had begun to lift slightly, and the occasional ray of sunshine was breaking through. Our next appointment with Alexei Romanov's widow had to be handled very delicately. The Romanov house was situated in a wealthy neighborhood of Brighton Beach, offshore Boulevard. Large houses with well-cared-for gardens. None of the trees had been optimistic enough to think about bursting into leaf yet. The temperature couldn't have been much above freezing. The door was answered by a maid, who took our names and left us waiting in the entrance hall. Soon, she returned and led us into an elegantly furnished dining room. Mrs. Romanoff then entered, a tall, gray-haired woman, wearing a black dress with a simple gold pin fastened at her throat. In her face, you could see the grief that she must have been going through. "Miss Delgado and Mr. Marley, welcome. Do sit down," she said. "We realize that this is not an appropriate time to visit," began Stella. "We're aware of the good work your late husband did with newly arrived Russian immigrants, and we'd like to offer our deepest sympathies." "Thank you. You're most kind," she said. "Our visit concerns Russian immigrants who may have been attempting to enter the country illegally. You may have heard about the bodies found on Jones Beach?" asked Stella. Mrs. Romanoff nodded. "They were probably young Russian men," Stella continued. "The boat they were sailing in was in a completely unseaworthy condition. Whoever was behind this immigrant smuggling operation had surely sent these boys to their deaths." Mrs. Romanoff frowned. I could see we had her attention. "But this is dreadful. Can I be of any assistance?" asked Mrs. Romanoff. "Poor Alexei would have moved heaven and earth to bring the people responsible to justice." I judged it was the right time to make my move. "I realize that this is not a suitable time to ask this question, ma'am," I said. "We know your husband was active with the Immigrant Welfare Society. Could he possibly have made any enemies in the Russian community? You see, there could be some connection between your husband's death and these poor boys found on Jones Beach." I really couldn't be absolutely sure of my facts here. But again, there was no harm in taking a chance if we were going to make any progress with Jose's case. "The police have already asked me all about—" began Mrs. Romanoff. She then paused and gave me a hard stare. "I don't think you're being completely truthful with me, Mr. Marley. What is the real reason for your visit?" It was time to put all our cards on the table. "Mrs. Romanoff, I apologize. Yes, I have been less than honest. I am a private investigator representing my client, Jose de la Cruz, who, as you know, has been charged with the murder of your late husband. I do not believe that your husband was the victim of a simple street crime. I suspect your husband had discovered something that put his life in danger." Mrs. Romanoff's face grew pale. She sat silently and still as I continued. "We also have to admit that our interest in this case is personal. Our client, Jose de la Cruz, is Ms. Delgado's younger brother." Stella turned to face Mrs. Romanoff. "Believe me, Mrs. Romanoff, this is difficult for me too. As God is my witness, my brother is not a killer, just a gentle, harmless, ordinary guy who must have been in the wrong place at the wrong time," said Stella. I continued. "As far as the NYPD are concerned, they've found their killer, but I'm not convinced. I am asking for your help in finding your husband's real killer or killers. I can't be more honest than that. Chapter 9. Viktor Kamenev. Mrs. Romanov stood up and stared out the window for a moment before speaking again. "Mr. Marley, Miss Delgado," she said, "I believe you are sincere. You may count on my cooperation and support." Stella looked at me and smiled. Mrs. Romanov continued, "You appreciate this is a very difficult time for me, but I'll do my best. There's something quite weird about the events of last week. I've had this feeling that the police have not made every effort to investigate the case fully. Alexei was well respected for all his community work. He had a fine reputation. He made friends rather than enemies. I think of all the people he's helped to settle here and become good American citizens, and I'm not aware of anyone who could have anything against him." "Did he ever mention any names? Any little remarks he made about people?" I asked. "Take your time." "There is something. Last night, I was going through Alexei's wardrobe, seeing what I could give away to charity. In a jacket pocket, I found a piece of paper rolled up into a ball. It was a short message in Russian with no date or address. It was a warning and just said, "I am telling you this in the strictest confidence. Mosolov could be dangerous. You don't know what you're getting involved with." It was signed Victor. "You still have the note?" I asked. Mrs. Romanov opened a desk drawer and took out the note. "Does the name Victor mean anything to you?" I asked. "No," she answered. "Well, it could be Viktor Kamenev, who runs a business by the name of Kamenev Finance," I said. "We'll have to check this out and get back to you. Have you informed the police about this?" "No. There's just been so much on my mind," she began. "I'd advise you to let them have the note immediately. But with your permission, I'd rather you didn't tell the NYPD about Kamenev until I've checked him out first." We left the house and made our way to the Brighton Beach subway and took an express Q train back to Manhattan. At last, some pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, but we were still a long way from the solution. We had another Russian connection. I wanted to pay a surprise visit to Mr. Kamenev, but I needed support. We could be moving in deep, dangerous waters. I made a call on my cell phone to Joe Blaney, an ex-NYPD colleague of mine. Joe is also an ex-NYPD heavyweight boxing champion. He retired a few years ago, but still looks impressively tough. Tough enough to scare people into cooperating. That's one good reason why he accompanies me on any job where there's an element of risk. "Joe, I have some work for you. Are you busy?" I asked. "I got nothing on," said Joe. "Meet me at McSorley's Ale House on East 7th Street at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I'll give you all the details then." Stella and I transferred to an uptown train at Broadway and Lafayette and got off at Astor Place in the middle of the East Village. Joe joined us in the bar just before 3. I gave him a brief outline of the story so far before we left for Kamenev's office. On the stairs up to the office, old wallpaper was peeling off the walls. On the upstairs landing, flattened cigarette butts covered the floor. "Elegant, huh?" muttered Joe. As we entered Kamenev's office, the contrast couldn't have been greater. Inside, all was clean, neat, and tastefully decorated. The floors were polished wood. Everywhere was the latest in office technology. In response to our request to speak to Kamenev, the receptionist said a little too automatically, "You don't have an appointment. Sorry, but Mr. Kamenev is busy with a client." There was no sound of conversation coming from his office. "Seems awfully quiet in there. Would you tell him Nat Marley wants to speak to him concerning Alexei Romanov?" She gave me a sour look and picked up the phone. She spoke briefly to him and then turned to me and said, "Seems that Mr. Kamenev's not so busy after all. You can go in." The guy behind the desk had to be Kamenev. A big man with rosy cheeks, bushy mustache, and a full head of curly hair. You could see his reflection in the polished wood of the large desk. Around the room were various framed photographs of life in the old Russia from the 19th century. "Mr. Kamenev? The name's Nat Marley, licensed private investigator. This is my assistant, Stella Delgado, and my colleague, Joe Blaney. I'll come straight to the point. I'm investigating the recent murder of Alexei Romanov. I believe you may have information concerning who was responsible for the killing." "I don't know anything. Who sent you here?" demanded Kamenev nervously. Kamenev suddenly opened a desk drawer and produced an automatic pistol. He pointed it at me with a trembling hand. Joe was equally quick. His old police special was pointing straight at Kamenev, but his hand was rock steady. "Mr. Kamenev," said Joe smoothly, "it's obvious you're no gunman. Let's use some common sense. I suggest you put that gun down." Kamenev sighed and placed the gun on the desk. Joe moved to the desk and emptied the bullets out of the weapon, then returned it to Kamenev. "Is it true that you sent a warning note to Mr. Romanov?" I asked. Kamenev eyed us suspiciously from behind his desk. "Before I say anything, I need to have a guarantee that you are genuine," he said. "By all means. I suggest you call Alexei Romanov's widow," I replied, and gave him the number. A conversation in rapid Russian followed. After a while, he put the phone down and looked at us. "My apologies. You understand, I have to be cautious." I glanced around the room again. There were also photographs of the old Russian royal family. Nicholas, the last of the Tsars, with Tsarina Alexandra. "You obviously love your country. You must be a patriot. Also, you must have been a friend of Alexei Romanov. Who were you trying to protect him from?" Silence. After a long pause, Kamenev spoke. "This is very difficult for me, Mr. Marley. It's really not wise to say anything more. If I were you, I'd stay away from all this. Kamenev looked uncomfortable. I wondered if he was too scared to talk, like the bartenders at the Odessa steps. I tried a different approach. Kamenev's business could be benefiting from the money coming in from the illegal immigrant operation. I had no proof, but it was worth a try. I want to speak to you about some poor Russian boys found dead on Jones Beach. I've heard a rumor that someone was laundering the money these boys paid to get into the country, money that needed to be integrated into the legal economy. I understand that's your line of business. Kamenev remained silent. Is money laundering part of your business? I insisted. Again, Kamenev didn't say anything. Let's get one thing straight, I said. I'm sure there's a whole lot of questions the IRS would love to ask about your accounts, but I'm not investigating your business. Let's get back to those poor young men who were washed up on Jones Beach. Whoever launders the money those boys paid to get into the country might as well have held a gun to their heads and pulled the trigger. Would it be you, by any chance? You see, they died because they'd been put in a boat that was falling apart. The boat split in two in the storm, and they drowned. In some way, you might share some responsibility for the deaths of 4 good Russian boys. I could see Kamenev's lips tightening. I knew what I said had found its target. I was appealing to his sense of honor. I hoped and prayed there was some honor left in him. 4 good Russian boys, I repeated. All they wanted was to enter the land of opportunity and make a success of their lives. And now they're dead. Their families back in Russia won't know what's happened to them. Maybe they saved up for years to give their sons this chance. But you won't be out of pocket. The money will still be coming in. Honest to God, stammered Kamenev, I don't ask questions. Their deaths couldn't be my fault. So, you were just the honest money launderer, huh? I asked. No questions asked and nothing on your conscience? Kamenev remained silent. Sweat started to form on his forehead. I have this feeling there's a connection between Romanov's death and those boys found drowned on Jones Beach. You follow what I'm saying? I went on. He nodded, but his expression was blank. I think you can help, I continued. Help us find the guys who sent those good Russians to their deaths. You're a patriot, and despite your line of business, I believe you're a man of honor. The most patriotic thing you could do is help us to find whoever is exploiting honest Russian people. We also want to find who really killed Alexei Romanov. That man did some fine work in the community, helping Russian folks to settle here. He remained silent. I nodded to Stella. Tell him, I said to her. Mr. Kamenev, Stella began, our interest in this case is also personal. My brother, Jose de la Cruz, has been wrongly accused of Alexei Romanov's murder. As far as the NYPD are concerned, he's guilty. We believe he was set up as the fall guy to take the blame. We need someone who knows the Russian community Someone who has the contacts and inside knowledge to help bring the real killers to justice. Kamenev took a deep breath and pushed his hands into his fists. Okay, said Kamenev. I admit that in my work I don't ask too many questions. Cash arrives from anonymous clients. I only know them by a number. But if innocent Russian boys have been killed and I've profited from it... I interrupted him. You still haven't told me why you sent the warning note to Romanov. Who's Marcelov? Marcelov runs some sort of operation in Brighton Beach and contacts me from time to time to expect a delivery of cash. We've never met, only exchanged coded emails and faxes. Monday last week, Marcelov emailed me and asked what I knew about Romanov. I asked why, and the reply was that Romanov had been asking inconvenient questions. I didn't want to get involved, so I just played it safe and denied any knowledge of Romanov, except what's known publicly. I suspected that Marcelov was dangerous, and so Romanov could be in danger. Thank you, Mr. Kamenev. Our problem is that we still have to prove who murdered Romanov, I said. Mr. Marley, I am a patriot, and I feel I owe a debt of honor towards my countrymen. How can I help? I'm going to set up a meeting with Alexei Romanov's widow, I said. I'd like you to be there. Expect a call from me tomorrow morning. Chapter 10. Witness. It was now just over a week since Alexei Romanov had been found murdered. People's memories tend to fade once events become part of the distant past. We needed to find witnesses while their memories were still fresh. Maybe the presence of Kamenev would help the bartenders at the Odessa steps to remember more about Wednesday night. I left Stella to do some phoning to set up a meeting with Kamenev and Mrs. Romanov. I suggested somewhere like a good restaurant in the Brighton Beach area, but I left the choice up to her. I had received another Coast Guard press release. Another body washed up on Jones Beach. The details were similar to those of the other victims. A male in his 20s. No form of identification on the body. No definite connection could be made with the previous fatalities on Jones Beach. But if there was a connection, just how many people had been on board that lifeboat when it left the ship for the Long Island shore? With the information about deaths of innocent Russian boys, I didn't anticipate too much difficulty in gaining the cooperation of the citizens of Brighton Beach. I had just finished reading the press release when the phone rang. I recognized the elegant English accent. Edie Tilden. Mr. Marley, I've seen a very suspicious incident on Fire Island. Had I been wise to encourage that eccentric old lady to play the investigator? Tell me all about it, I said. I spent yesterday beachcombing along the eastern tip of Fire Island, and I saw this man who didn't look like he really belonged on a beach, she said. What do you mean by didn't belong? He wasn't dressed properly. Too formal. He was wearing an overcoat over a gray suit, shiny black shoes. He was looking out at the ocean through binoculars, but I don't think he was watching the wildlife. Could you describe him? I asked. Well, he was tall, 6 feet plus, with a big build. But, you see, Mr. Marley, I saw all this from a distance. As soon as I got closer, he left. Perhaps he was frightened by the sight of Edie Tilden. What she had witnessed could be relevant, or could have been entirely innocent. Fire Island is the next narrow strip of land off the Long Island mainland, to the east of Jones Beach. Anyway, I stored away the information, thanked her, and returned to our immediate concerns. Stella had made the necessary arrangements. A midday meeting at Café Paris in Brighton Beach. A table had been booked, and Kamenev was on his way to pick us up. It would be a pleasant change to travel to Brighton Beach by car instead of the subway. Things with Kamenev were now more relaxed, so we were able to get to know one another a little better. Victor Kamenev's family, we learned, left Russia and settled in America many years ago. Like many in the Russian-American community, Russian was his first language, and he and his relatives had remained true to their cultural roots. The car was now leaving Manhattan, crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. Below, the wind was whipping up the waters of the East River into white-tipped waves. Above us, on the footbridge, people were walking into Manhattan, well wrapped up against the cold. Soon, we were cruising along Flatbush Avenue, with the skyscrapers of Manhattan fading into the distance. The conversation turned to recent events. Mr. Marley, Kamenev started, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation yesterday. I'll ask whatever questions you want me to. I can put pressure on people and ask for favors. There are people around Brighton Beach who owe me money. The prospect of negotiating a debt should encourage someone to talk. The car was now rolling through the suburbs of Brooklyn. The rest of the journey passed sociably. On arriving at the Café Paris, we met Mrs. Romanoff, who was waiting in the reception area. We were taken over to our table, where I made the introductions. Mrs. Romanoff, you've already met Stella, and this is Mr. Victor Kamenev. Mr. Kamenev is as anxious as you are to get justice for your husband. Mr. Kamenev sent the warning note to your late husband. Not surprisingly, Mrs. Romanoff looked extremely tense. After ordering, Mrs. Romanoff questioned Kamenev. A long conversation in Russian. To begin with, Mrs. Romanoff's voice was sharp. I held my breath and crossed my fingers. But soon she sounded much friendlier. I breathed out. Then they shook hands warmly. Mrs. Romanoff addressed everybody. I'm sorry about that. I needed to be absolutely sure about Mr. Kamenev. Now I feel I can trust him. This is a very difficult time for me. It's little more than a week since poor Alexei was so cruelly murdered. I want to thank you all very sincerely for coming here. Mr. Marley, I know you said your interest in this case was personal. Naturally, mine is too. I know you must have other work you should be doing, and this investigation must be a considerable expense. Well, not really, ma'am, I began. Mr. Marley, you're a very poor liar. I'm hiring you to find my husband's murderer, whatever the cost. I could certainly use the money. I hadn't done any other work since I'd heard the news about Jose, and there was still the office rent, taxes, and salaries to pay. Thank you, ma'am. I accept. Stella will draw up a contract. After a discussion over lunch, there seemed to be two clear avenues of investigation. One was the Odessa Steppes. Having a member of the Russian community with us could help to make some progress there. The other avenue was Alexei Romanov's computer files, particularly those concerning the Immigrant Welfare Society. Computer skills were Stella's specialty, so she left with Mrs. Romanov to examine the computer, while I paid a visit to the bar with Kamenev. When we arrived, the lunchtime crowd was building up. I took Victor over to the display of sports souvenirs. I showed him the baseball bat Jose had grabbed. The bat was now securely fixed to the wall with metal bands and strong screws. I gave Kamenev all the background information he might need about Jose's night out in Brighton Beach. I recognized the bartender I'd spoken with on my previous visit. He was laughing and joking with the regular customers. His face dropped as soon as he saw me holding up Jose's picture. "Remember me?" I asked. "I was asking you about this guy who'd been drinking here last Wednesday night. His name's Jose, and he's in a lot of trouble. I got the impression you were suffering from a little memory loss. Or maybe you were just confused. I've brought a friend along to help you remember." The bartender stood there silently. Sweat started to form on his forehead. He looked like a frightened animal, nervous and vulnerable. "I didn't see nothing. I swear, I didn't see nothing," he repeated. Meanwhile, a smartly dressed guy, who I took to be the manager, joined the bartender. "What's going on here?" he asked. "I'll have no harassment of my staff." The moment he made eye contact with Kamenev, the manager froze and lowered his head. Victor spoke to him in Russian. It sounded like a heated argument at first, but tempers soon cooled. The manager waved to the bartender, who poured drinks for Kamenev and myself. "Mikhail, the bar manager, has just remembered how much in debt he is to me. I've offered to be flexible about the repayments, provided we get some information. Shall we move into your office, Mikhail?" The bartender told us that Jose had woken up in the bar alone. He was sleepy and confused. He stood up, reached out an arm, grabbed the baseball bat, fell over, and just lay there. The regular customers at the bar were very offended. Who was this guy damaging the sacred bat? Before anyone could lay a hand on him, someone else had got involved and protected Jose from the furious regulars. This guy had taken pity on him and said he'd help get him home. I was getting very interested indeed. There were a whole lot of questions I needed to ask via Kamenev's interpreting. The guy who helped Jose. Name? I asked. The bartender paused and looked fearfully toward his boss, who nodded his permission. He's called Nick Zernov. If you know what's good for you, you'll stay clear of him. He's a real bad guy. That explained why he had the power to protect Jose from an angry crowd. Zernov had seen the opportunity to use Jose as the fall guy, to make Jose appear guilty for a murder. Give me a full description of Zernov, will you? I asked. Tall, over 6 feet, and muscular. Black hair, cut really short. Thick black eyebrows. His nose looks like someone broke it. Likes to wear expensive suits. Shiny material. I experienced that thrill you get when you realize some parts of the puzzle might at last be fitting together. I recalled Edie Tilden's description of the guy she'd seen on Fire Island. I had to remind myself not to get overexcited. We still had nothing concrete yet. I continued with the questioning. How drunk was Jose? Could he stand up? He was a bit unsteady after Zernov picked him up, but otherwise okay. He had a few more drinks, and then Zernov took him outside. That's all I know, the bartender said. You know, this guy Jose is facing a murder charge. They think he killed Alexei Romanov. Jose was just a harmless drunk. I don't believe he is the killer, I said. The name Romanov meant something to the bartender. His face brightened. Mr. Romanov helped me and my family. Such a good man. I had a final question. Would you be prepared to tell the police what you've just told us? Another discussion in Russian between Kamenev and the bartender. The bartender frowned and shook his head. Then he said something, almost in a whisper. Before I got the translation, I knew it meant no. The bartender was clearly terrified. Chapter 11. Progress. It was time to see how Stella had been doing at the Romanov house with the computer files. As Kamenev's car rolled along Shore Boulevard, I was thinking about the case. I told Kamenev my theory. Victor, I think we have enough new information to encourage the police to follow a new line of investigation. We now know that Jose left the bar with a guy who has local criminal connections. Zernov doesn't sound like the type of guy who'd rescue someone from a beating purely out of warm, sympathetic feelings toward his fellow men. So my theory is that Zernov saw an opportunity to use Jose as the fall guy. But what about all the evidence against your client? The forensics? And the murder weapon? Asked Kamenev. It'd be quite easy for Zernov to kill Romanov, I explained. Then, for him to wipe the gun clean, grip Jose's hand around it, leaving his fingerprints on the gun. Even easier to do if Jose was already unconscious. Back at the house, Stella had found something. a file protected by a password. Whatever she tried, family names or place names, she couldn't open the file. I glanced around the room. There were a number of photographs of old Russia. Opposite the desk was a picture of a wide avenue in a major city. Mrs. Romanoff noticed me studying the picture. Poor Alexei loved that street scene, she said. It's the Nevsky Prospect in Old St. Petersburg. That's an idea. Why don't you try typing in Nevsky Prospect? Could you spell that out for me? Asked Stella. Again, the computer denied us access. Stella keyed in the words individually, but still no success. Mrs. Romanoff had another suggestion. That street is named after the Russian national hero, Alexander Nevsky. Try his name, suggested Mrs. Romanoff. Stella keyed in the words. This time, the protected file opened. There were lists of dates going back over the past 2 years at regular intervals. Next to some of the dates were Russian names, sometimes with local addresses. By some of the names, there was a capital M with a question mark. The most recent date was last Friday. There were also a couple of future dates with an M question mark next to them. The first of these was Saturday, March 16th. What do you make of that? Asked Stella. Well, M could stand for Mosolov, said Kamenev. Okay, if we assume that Zernov works for Mosolov, I said, and if we can find out what sort of operation Mosolov is running, then things should fall into place. Mrs. Romanoff had been examining the names and dates in the computer file. Mr. Marley, I know some of these names. Some of them are people who Alexei helped through the Immigrant Welfare Society. This one here, Boris Chernov. I know he entered the country illegally. Could Mosolov be smuggling in Russian immigrants? Could these be the dates when they were brought in? It's possible, but we'd still need more proof, I answered. I'd like to talk to Chernov, but it would be helpful if you would accompany me, Mrs. Romanoff, so there's someone he knows and trusts. But that will have to wait until tomorrow. It's time I had another talk with Captain Oldenburg. Stella, would you print me out a couple of hard copies of that file? We said our goodbyes to Mrs. Romanoff and left with Kamenev in his car. Kamenev dropped us off at Police Plaza in Manhattan. A sergeant led us to Oldenburg's office. Oldenburg was sitting with his feet up on the desk and didn't bother to remove them when we entered. Please don't stand up just for us, Oldenburg, I said. What makes you think I would? Growled the captain. I don't suppose you want some coffee. Thanks for the hospitality, but if it's NYPD coffee, we'll do without it. Sensible decision. Now, what can I do for you, Molly? He asked, at last removing his feet from the desk. There was the usual expression on the captain's face, which seemed to say that life and work were an annoyance, and I wasn't making things any better. It was time to get him interested. "The Odessa Steps, Brighton Beach," I began. "You remember I told you that Jose pulled that baseball bat off the wall and then got out of that bar unharmed? Well, the reason was that he had a protector." "Go on, Marley. You're beginning to interest me," said Oldenburg. "I also got a witness, but I doubt whether he'd give a statement to the police. A bartender saw Jose leave the bar with a big, smartly dressed guy. We have a name, Nick Zernoff. He's part of a local gang." "How do you spell that?" asked the captain. There was a rare burst of energy from Oldenburg as he swung around in his chair to the computer and typed in the name. A list of names came up on the screen, including a Nikolai Zernoff. "He's known as Nick, so this Nikolai could be the guy," I suggested. Oldenburg opened the file. The photo matched the bartender's description. Zernoff had a long criminal record. Like the bartender in the Odessa Steps had said, he was a guy to avoid. He'd been charged with murder but found not guilty, and had served a 4-year prison sentence for robbery. "Oldenburg, I'm positive that's the guy who killed Romanoff," I said. "Would you print me out a couple of copies of the picture?" "So, if he is, where's your proof?" demanded Oldenburg. "I don't have anything to charge him with." "Well, let's provide you with more new evidence," I continued. "You already know about the warning note which Mrs. Romanoff found in her husband's jacket. I've found the guy who wrote it, a Victor Kamenev, who owns Kamenev Finance. He has a lot of contacts in the Russian community. He discovered that Romanoff had been doing some personal investigation into what could be an illegal immigrant smuggling operation. But his questions had really bothered someone by the name of Masalov. Kamenev knew Masalov was angry, so he sent the warning note to Romanoff. "Okay, let's check to see if there's anything on this Masalov," said Oldenburg. He typed in the name, but the screen remained blank. He paused and thought for a moment. "If I'm going to charge Zernoff, I need solid evidence. We have nothing on him, except for the fact he left the Odessa Steps with Dela Cruz. It'll be easier to find evidence against Zernoff if he's under the impression that Dela Cruz is charged with murder. You see where this is leading, Marley?" "You mean the official NYPD line is that Jose is the killer, case closed. The unofficial line is that the investigation quietly continues," I suggested. "You got it," said Oldenburg. "I'll have a police surveillance team watch Zernoff's movements without being seen." Suddenly, Stella's cell phone rang. She rushed out into the hallway to answer it. There was a scream of joy, followed by rapid Spanish conversation. She rushed back into the room with tears in her eyes and grinning broadly. "Nat, that was Mom! Jose's going to be all right! He regained consciousness this afternoon, and he's been talking to her. The doctors think the operation was a success." "That's great news, Stella. Now, if you'll excuse us, Oldenburg, We need to get over to the hospital. Okay, Marley, said Oldenburg. I'll call the guard and tell him to expect you. The rush hour traffic was crawling through Manhattan. To avoid the chaos on the streets, we took the subway uptown from City Hall to 103rd Street. From there, it was only a few blocks' walk to the hospital. Stella ran on ahead. I finally reached Jose's room, and through the window saw Stella sitting beside the bed, smiling at Jose. I knocked softly on the door. Stella came out into the hall. "Nat," said Stella. "Strict orders from the nurse. Don't get Jose overexcited. He can talk, but it's all a big effort. He just needs plenty of rest. We've only been allowed 10 minutes. Jose recognized me as I walked in. "Nat, thanks for what you did on the roof. It's all a bit vague, but I'm told you saved my life." "Don't worry," I replied. "Everything's okay now." "What do you mean, okay?" he asked, trying to sit up in bed. "I'm facing a murder charge." "Come on, Jose. Just lie down and try to relax," said Stella. "You've got to rest." She smiled at him and gently stroked his hand. As soon as Jose was calmer, I spoke to him again. "Jose, we've spent the last week investigating. We're turning up new evidence all the time. Just trust us. We're doing everything possible to clear your name. I want you to concentrate on recovering. Be a good patient." "Nat, I can remember something," said Jose. "When I woke up in the bar, Miguel and Carlos weren't around. I stood up, but lost my balance. I reached out and grabbed the first thing I saw to stop myself from falling. It came off in my hand. Then there I was, lying on the floor with all these angry guys looking at me. I can't remember what happened after that." "Thanks, Jose," I said. It was time to leave Jose to rest. I succeeded in persuading Stella to go home. Before going back to Queens, I thought I should stop by at East 43rd Street to check if there had been any messages. An email had arrived from Commander Lockhart of the U.S. Coast Guard. It read, "Dear Mr. Marley, please contact me as soon as possible. We have some new evidence here that may be connected with the wrecked lifeboat and fatalities at Jones Beach. It's a Russian fishing boat, which was wrecked on Jones Beach last night. I'd like to show it to you. Best wishes, Jim Lockhart, Commander, U.S. Coast Guard Group, Mauritius." I was very interested indeed. I called Lockhart immediately to confirm that I would be there in the morning. Enough investigating for one day. It was time to go home. Chapter 12. Wreck on Jones Beach.